Hello, you're watching CNN Money Switzerland with the latest news headlines on Thursday, the 25th of June. I'm Hannah Wise. Hotel Plan says it is cutting 170 jobs here in Switzerland and that 12 of its 98 travel agencies will close because of the coronavirus crisis. The Migros-owned subsidiary, which employs around 1,200 people in Switzerland, said it was forced to take these measures after the outbreak had paralysed the travel industry across the globe. Its business divisions in Germany and the United Kingdom will also be restructured, resulting in the loss of 425 jobs across the group. Shares in Lufthansa, the parent company of Swiss, soared as much as 20% at times today on news that its bailout looks more secure. Now, this comes after an 11th hour reprieve from top shareholder, billionaire Heinz Hermann Thiele, who last night backed the proposal, which would see the German government take a 20% stake in the company and board seats, which would result in diluting existing shareholdings. France and Germany have today pledged additional funding for the World Health Organization in its fight against the coronavirus pandemic. At a live press conference at the WHO headquarters in Geneva this afternoon, German Health Minister Jens Spahn said Berlin would be giving a record €500 million in funding and medical equipment to the UN agency this year. France, meanwhile, said it would commit an extra 50 million euros as well as 100 million masks. This comes as more than 135,000 cases were reported worldwide in the past day, bringing the new total to more than 9.1 million. Now, when it comes to economic recovery post-coronavirus, it's not just size that matters, but shape as well. And BlackRock sees it as a V-shaped recovery for now. I spoke to their chief investment strategist earlier today to find out what could knock that, though, off track.
Okay, Martin, it's a pleasure to have you back on CNN Money Switzerland. Thanks for joining us. Let's have a look at what's going to happen then in the next 6 months, if you could kind of look into your crystal ball. I know that BlackRock is pretty positive on European recovery. Why is that?
First of all, we think it is a good time to be a bit more positive on Europe for two reasons mainly. One is if we have a cyclical recovery, as many people now expect, really bouncing back from the lows of the coronavirus recession, then Europe should outperform because of its more cyclical exposure on equity markets. Secondly, we have seen some good news of late regarding a European recovery fund, so European countries, especially in the Eurozone, getting closer together and really getting their act together when it comes to finding a solidarity approach, also helping out those countries that suffered most from the coronavirus crisis, which are, by the way, those countries that also suffered most from the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009.
And what kind of recovery are we looking at? I mean, does shape matter here?
That's absolutely right. And I think, we have been discussing such a lot about the shape of the letter. Is it a V? Is it a U? Is it an L maybe? Or is it something else? So I think that at this point in time, we can already rule out something like a wider U, or we can also rule out an L shape, so really dropping down and then going sideways. Why is that? Because we can already see that the first signs of recovery are showing up. We can see that purchasing manager indicators are basically bouncing back quite significantly. So the first shape of the recovery will definitely look like a V. The question is, will it look like a V all to the end, or will it look like a kind of distorted V with a more shallow recovery at a later stage? And I think this is absolutely likely. So the first stage of the recovery is looking pretty promising, but we need to wait for for confirmation at a later stage, because that depends on the behavior of consumers and of companies.
All right. Well, I mean, when we talk about recovery, how much are you looking at China and the recovery there as to your inspiration for what's going to happen here in Europe?
Well, that's the first large economy that went into the recession and then came out of it. And China had a pretty short lockdown. If you compare it to some European countries, the lockdown in the Wuhan region was roughly 6 weeks. And then China declared that they wanted to go back to full activity right after the early days of April. And what the data that we have ever since then shows two things. First of all, in all the fields where the Communist Party can dictate what happens, that is state activity, that is basically also turnover in container ports and the broader activity, you can see that it has reasonably bounced back and that it is back to normal, sometimes above 100% of pre-crisis activity. But in those fields where individual consumers take their decisions and really decide on whether they want to go out or do they want to stay at home, that is mostly fields where activity is still delayed, where it's still held back, and where consumers are still reluctant really to go out because they are afraid of getting infected. So I think it is something like a two-speed recovery, and we will probably see the same thing happening in our region and also in the Americas.
How much are you factoring a second wave, though?
Well, a second wave would actually the case for me to expect something like a W shape, and it would also be very detrimental in terms of the recovery, both in terms of a real activity picking up and also in terms of sentiment. For example, when it comes to consumer patterns and the way that people are really confident in going out and travel and consume. So a second wave would be absolutely disastrous. And for the time being, we cannot talk about second wave because we're still in the later phase of the first wave developing, and you can see that in some countries, like super spreading events like we had in the meat processing plant here in the west of Germany. You can never rule out anything really happening, even if you don't expect, even if you think that you have the pandemic under control. So I think a second wave later in the year, especially when we go into the autumn, would be the biggest threat for the recovery at this point in time.
All right, so what's your asset allocation then if you're looking at recovery here in Europe, and how much does the United States factor into that?
Well, as I said in the beginning, Europe is more exposed to a cyclical recovery. So if you really were to see a strong cyclical upswing, then it would be good to be positioned in some kind of more cyclical exposure. It would be good to be into more industrial companies that are geared into global trade. However, if you want to take the risk into account that there could be a second wave or that the recovery is much more shallow than we expect at this point in time, then it would be good to be positioned in the more defensive parts of the market, where we see healthcare definitely continuing to outperform. We can also see some of the quality companies, where many of them you will find in the technology sector, which has outperformed in the past, and in which in this case would also continue to outperform in the future. And also we need to keep in mind that in the fixed income part of the portfolio, it is very hard to achieve positive yields at this point in time. So we definitely want to replace some of these yields by investment in alternative assets like private markets and also infrastructure and real estate.
How about the US election? How is this playing into your outlook for 2020?
Well, it's interesting to see that for the time being, the market does not take it into account, and also the risk that Donald Trump might actually lose this election is not reflected in the in market valuations yet. However, if the election were to be held today, it would be very likely that Vice President Biden would win. And in that case, markets would probably take a hit. Why is that? Because, of course, the Democrats would probably want to reintroduce some of the regulation that the Trump administration has removed in the last 3.5 years, and also some other not so market-friendly changes, like maybe also reforms to the tax system that would be not so friendly for investors and equity holders. So in that regard, it is interesting to see that from today's perspective, the likelihood of Joe Biden winning is pretty high, but the market has not taken that into account and priced it yet.
And just to wrap up, I mean, what are you expecting from central banks in the coming months?
Well, I think that central banks will continue to stand ready to do basically everything. This is the biggest whatever it takes operation in history. This is really revolutionary in the sense that central banks have never stepped in to that degree as they are doing right now. So from that angle, I would expect central banks, also in terms of the communication that they have, to really convince investors that they stand ready to expand their programs, and especially that they will be buying issuance from governments when governments need to increase their public sector spending to stem the pandemic. and central banks will stand ready to purchase all the issuance. I think this is very important for investors to really keep their confidence that this recovery is here to stay. And I think central banks will want to do everything to transmit this message.
Now, 4 years after Swiss illustrator Jared Muralt began work on The Fall, the comic book series is suddenly getting a lot more attention with the publication of its second volume. Coinciding with the coronavirus pandemic, it tells the story of a man holed up with his 2 children in the Swiss mountains after a devastating pandemic. And if that sounds familiar, the similarities to the coronavirus end there. Humanity driven to the edge after a deadly epidemic. People aggressively looking for food in empty supermarket shelves. Cities haunted by chaos and families fleeing cities. When Swiss comic book artist Jared Muralt started drawing his first volume of The Fall, about a devastating pandemic changing our societies, he didn't think COVID-19 would change our lives just 4 years later.
I needed a reason why the world or society ended. So I took the most likely scenario to happen, and that was a pandemic. I wanted to explore human behavior in a post-apocalyptic world, how humans behave in a crashed world. I can see similarities at the beginning of my book, where the characters stay at home in their lockdown, but what follows after that is pretty different than what we experience now.
In the second volume of the series, the protagonists, a father and his 2 children, flee to the Alps. The topical issue has made Muralt not only popular in the Swiss, French and German comic market world, but has also sparked the interest of international publishers.
For my career, it was a special moment because the second book of the series just came out with the start of the lockdown in Switzerland. And of course it gave the whole series a boost. It was discussed in the media. I'm in negotiation with Image Comics, a US comic publisher. It was a happy coincidence for me. Although I couldn't do any book vernissage or signings, which I usually do when a new book comes out. But happily, there is social media and the internet, and I could still sell my books.
Making a living as a comic book artist is possible, says Muralt, but not without initial self-investment.
I didn't count the earnings until today. I sold about 1,000 books and I have to reprint them, and that cost me a lot of money again. So if I would have counted better, I would have printed much more books right in the beginning, but that's a lesson I've learned.
Fans will need to wait another 2 years for the third in the series, when our protagonists come back from the Alps to a very changed society. Now, COVID-19 has caused the longest closure for the Eiffel Tower in Paris since the Second World War. But now, as it begins to reopen, everything won't quite be back to normal just yet, as CNN's Cyril Vanier reports.
The Eiffel Tower is partially reopening to visitors today after its longest shutdown since the Second World War. An estimated 4,000 to 5,000 visitors are expected today. Now that is a far cry from the 23,000 who would normally be visiting the Eiffel Tower at this time of year every day. And for the people who do come here today, it's going to be a slightly different Eiffel Tower experience. They are encouraged to book their tickets ahead of time so as to avoid long queues forming at the ticketing office. You have to wear face masks within the perimeter of the Eiffel Tower. There's going to be hand gel. There is signage to direct the traffic of people when you're on the monument. And crucially, in order to avoid crowds in a confined space, well, the lifts are, for the moment, out of use. Meaning that if you want to enjoy the view from, say, the first or second level of the tower, well, you're going to have to earn it. It's 745 steps to the second level of the tower. That's a 15 to 20 minute climb. And sadly, because there are no steps between the second and third level, only lifts, that means that for now, the very top of the Eiffel Tower remains closed to visitors. Cyril Vanier, Paris.
Well, that's you up to date this Thursday with all the latest news headlines. Don't forget, everything is available on our website as well, cnnmoney.ch, and you can follow us on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Bye-bye.